One way of validating the extent to which processes are under control, and probably the most effective way and the way that ITIL recommends, is to undertake a process maturity analysis. And ITIL uses the same 5-point scale that CMMI uses, and indeed COBIT uses, and a number of other frameworks, to measure maturity. 1 is low, 5 is high. So level 1, defined as initial, essentially means there's activities going on, but there's no control. Things happen, but they're potentially chaotic or disorganized. There's no documentation, there's no training, there's no measurement, but things are happening. Obviously not ideal. Level 2 is described as repeatable, and the key characteristic of repeatable is that the activities are largely repeatable, but only because the same people are performing them. If you put new people in or migrate the activity to a new team, typically you won't get the same result. And the reason for that, similarly, is there isn't documentation, there isn't necessarily much training, there's no measurement, etc. But there's some consistency because of this fact that the same people are undertaking it. Target level for most processes and most organisations is level 3. Level 3 is known as defined. And the key characteristics for a process to be at a defined level is that there is a process owner, someone accountable for the process. There is documentation that describes how to undertake the procedures and activities. There is measurement that demonstrates what's happening and allows us to understand how effective that is. And there is reporting. Those are the key characteristics of defined. And you might think, well, that's fine. How do we get to level 4 and 5 then? What more can we do? Level 4 is described as managed, and the key difference between level 3 and level 4 is that at level 4 we're using the measurement and the reporting that we've generated from a maturity 3 level environment to understand where there's potential for improvement, where things are going wrong, where there's ways we could be more efficient and more effective, and we're starting to introduce those. So level 4 is characterised by introducing improvements over time, which ultimately gets us to level 5, which is described as optimised. And again, I want to stress the point that it's absolutely not necessary for every organisation to get every process to level 5. Typically level 3 is an aspirational level, and maybe worryingly, we've conducted nearly 200 process analyses over the world over the last 20 years, and the majority of processes in the majority of organisations are still only at level 2 to 2.5. We're now going to look at the 2 key roles in ITIL. These are known as the quality assurance roles because they're critical in terms of controlling, respectively, services and processes. These are the role of the service owner and the process owner. When we talked earlier about a service, the definition of a service was a means of delivering value to one or more customers by facilitating outcomes they want to achieve without the specific ownership and risk. So the service owner, in plain English, the owner of a service. If your organisation has a service catalogue, then every entry in that service catalogue constitutes a service for which there should be a service owner. There is a slight wrinkle in ITIL in that the service owner in ITIL is an IT person, but ultimately, of course, any service, any business service is owned by a business owner. And so the ITIL service owner is the person within IT who has the highest level of responsibility, i.e. is accountable for the service, but they will face off to their business counterpart who has ultimate accountability for the service. And the simple test of that is to query whether the internal IT service owner can turn a service off without reference to the business service owner in a time when it's normally expected to be available, to which the answer is nearly always no. The process owner, similarly, we just mentioned, owns the process, is accountable. And when I talk about accountability, implicitly you can only have one person accountable for a process and similarly for a service. The spooky thing is the word one is embedded in the word owner. However, again, these are roles, and that means one individual can have more than one role. So they could be a service owner of one or more services. They could also be a process owner of one or more processes. And indeed, the roles we haven't talked about, they could be a process manager, actually managing the day-to-day activity. The challenge is to put these roles into an organisation, which, if you remember me saying, are necessary to achieve maturity level 3, needs to recognise matrix management. The process owner role has essentially two components to it. There's an initial setup of the process, which we talked about was writing the policy, defining the objectives and what's going to be measured. That's relatively straightforward and could be done in maybe as little as half a day for some processes. On an ongoing basis, the process owner's accountabilities and responsibilities are: is the process being followed? Is it as efficient and effective as it might be? And how might it be improved? If you think about that, that may only be an hour or two a month. And that's why these are not full-time roles, and why typically one person can not only have a business as usual role, but also have more than one of these roles. What we're going to look at now is, of the 26 processes that are in our ITIL framework, we're going to look at 13 of these to give you a flavour of what the processes are providing and how they operate. Bear in mind there's 26 and we're going to be covering 13. The first of these, and I'm going to work my way through the service life cycle. So the first one is a strategy process that's called Service Portfolio Management. Service Portfolio Management, again, switch the words around to get the meaning. It's the management of the portfolio of services. Now, the service portfolio has three components to it. It has the pipeline, which represents services in development that have been commissioned or chartered by the business and are being developed and tested. The second component of the portfolio is the service catalogue, which represents the services that are currently live and available for use. And the third component of the portfolio is the retired services. What service portfolio management is doing is making sure not only that the decisions that we make about what to put into the pipeline, when to put them live and when to retire them are justified. It's making sure those services add maximum value. It's helping us understand how different services add different value and how maybe by reorientating the service or putting it on a new technology platform, we can add more value. It also produces proposals for changes. Major changes would come from service portfolio management, who is in effect the process, or which is the process that's sponsoring the change. Now, in ITIL terms, every process has defined purpose and objectives. The purpose is what we're intending to achieve through the process. The objectives essentially describe how we're going to achieve that purpose. And so the objectives for service portfolio management is to have a method of evaluating potential investments to ensure that we produce a valid business case for making a change and spending the money. We want to make sure that investment continues to pay dividends throughout the life cycle of the service, not just in design. We need to maintain a portfolio of services, and the element of the live services that describes that is the catalogue, as we mentioned earlier. We need to make sure that our service portfolio meets users' requirements and that we've got the services we need in place, or that we've acquired them from an external source like a third party. And the reporting helps us validate that all those objectives have been met. So service portfolio management, again a strategic process, the management of the entire portfolio of services across the entire life cycle of those services. It goes without saying that financial management is an important process. It's the management of IT finances. Clearly a strategy process, but equally clearly a process that has relevance across the entire life cycle. The challenge is to make sure we've got appropriate funding for the services that we're designing, building, operating, etc. To make sure that we make informed decisions and get the best value for money. To manage the company's financial assets and understand how those are going to change over time. And then in terms of concepts associated with finance, there's always this challenge of balancing the cost and the quality with the supply and the demand. And so finance has decisions to make about whether to support certain services, how to support them, to make most effective use of the IT budget. That takes us on to the three key components of IT finance. Budgeting, which is all about planning how much money we're going to need for the forthcoming accounting period, typically the next financial year, and where that money is going to come from. all of which of course is based on two things. It's maintaining the services that we're currently running, and it's adding new services to that mix and managing the cost of those. Budgeting is critical because it helps us plan for forthcoming expenditure in a cost-efficient way. Accounting is the practice of keeping track of what we spent. So whenever we spend more than a certain amount, the level at which we capitalise an asset, typically it might be £500 or £1,000, we keep a record of what it is we've spent, we associate it with a cost centre, and we attribute it to a cost code, depending on what it is we've bought and who owns that asset. Of course, once we've started keeping track of spend, we've then got the ability to compare what we spent with what we said we spent in the budget. And there's usually a difference which we then have to manage. Although charging is considered a core aspect of finance, many internal operations of course don't charge directly for their IT services. The cost of IT is an apportioned overhead, typically based on the number of users or PCs in an organisation. But of course, if you're an external service provider providing services to other organisations via a contract, then you will be charging for those services. What ITIL also talks about that isn't on this slide is service costing. And that's actually quite an important concept because it says we don't necessarily need to charge for our services. What we should do is understand what they cost to provide. And so the challenge is understanding the cost of service provision, which is more challenging than it sounds, because what that means is taking our technology costs such as infrastructure, networks, disk, processors, also our people cost, our network costs, our overheads, and attributing those costs to services. Easier said than done because of course many of those component technology costs are shared across more than one service. But if we can do that and we can understand the cost of providing services, then that can be extremely insightful for an organisation. The last finance concept on the slide, the business case, which is the decision support and planning tool. So it means what it means in plain English. It's the decision document, if you like, that helps us understand what the ramifications are of spending a certain amount of money in terms of return on investment or potentially value on investment. So it isn't just return on investment. If we take the example of a hospital trust putting several million into buying a new scanner, they're not doing that to earn money. They're investing in that scanner in order to be able to diagnose a condition more effectively, maybe quicker, be able to apply the right treatment and ultimately extend quality of life and potentially even life expectancy. So the decision to invest in the scanner isn't just measured as a return on investment. And the business case should cover all of those dimensions, all of those perspectives, as well as, of course, what happens if we don't spend that money, because every financial controller has those two options at least. Our next process is business relationship management. And again, as I've said before, you get the meaning of these by swapping the words around. It's the management of the relationship with the business. This is important because it's no good just throwing technology at the business and expecting them to use it. It's no good us assuming we know what the business needs. This is the process that maintains a relationship, as we'll see in a moment, at the highest level with the senior stakeholders in the business to ensure that we understand the business requirements, to ensure that we deliver against them, to ensure that we understand how those requirements are going to change over time and make sure we continue to deliver value. And the way we do that is to make sure we understand that customer perspective by having people who fill the business relationship manager role who understand both the business and IT, what we call hybrids. These people will also help us understand and justify the need for new services. And already you can start seeing an overlap here with service portfolio management and potentially financial management. And this brings into play another dimension to ITIL, that although we've got these 26 discrete processes, there are significant interfaces, overlaps, interdependencies between these processes. And if we were to explain the interrelationship between processes, I'd be here all day because they're many and various. If I can show you this in a slightly different way, this describes the three relationship elements that ITIL recognises and helps us distinguish between them. What we're talking about here is the level of relationship at the top, business relationship, that, as I said, engages with the most senior stakeholders in the organisation. These three levels are separated by three things. So the first thing that separates them is the level of engagement with the business. And you can see how that varies across these three levels. I'll explain more in a moment. The second thing that separates these three levels is the type of relationship. And what we see at the business relationship management level is that we have a strategic relationship with the business. And the third thing that separates these is typically the planning horizon, or the perspective in terms of time that we're looking at. And the business relationship management perspective is typically 1 to 5 years ahead, sometimes even more, maybe 10 or even 25 years. At the opposite end of the scale, we've got the service desk, which is engaging with users. Not saying they're the bottom of the pile, because of course any of the people who represent the senior stakeholders could at any time have an incident and have cause to call the service desk. But in that case they'd be acting out the role of a user. And the service desk exists to support those users at an operational level. And frankly, there's no planning horizon there. It happens on a day-to-day basis, minute by minute. In the middle, and this is a process we'll look again in more detail in a moment, we've got service level management, which is a tactical relationship with customer representatives, typically the managers of the IT users and the people who report to the senior stakeholders. And their planning perspective is typically 1 month to 12 months ahead. I'm saying typical because I go back to my statement right at the beginning that ITIL is not prescriptive. It simply says you should ideally have these three levels, recognise these, document them, manage them, but how you do it is up to you. But the purpose of this diagram is to really show how these relationship levels operate and relate to each other. Now, we mentioned the service catalogue as being part of the service portfolio. It's the part of the portfolio that represents the live services. So the purpose of this process is to provide, as it says, a single source of consistent information about our services. Now, that's typically going to be the live services, but ITIL says you might want to make reference to services coming down the pipeline for the benefit of the users that we've got something new coming on stream in the next few months. So the catalogue management process produces and maintains the service catalogue. In other words, the catalogue of services that are currently or about to become available. And the challenge here is to provide that information in a simple, consumable way that customers recognise and understand. And when we talk about the service catalogue, we typically talk in ITIL terms about the business or customer view of the service catalogue. What that means is the customers see the services they can engage with, and those services are described in plain English. So for instance, we'd be talking about the payroll service. We might be talking about the email service, or it might be part of a bigger communication service that includes, for instance, fixed and mobile telephony. It might include document storage, although that might be a separate service. How you do it again is up to you. What would also go in the service catalogue, a typical service catalogue entry would say what the service provides, why you should use it, when it's available, how you go about accessing it, how you make changes to it, that allows a customer to make a decision on whether this is a service appropriate to them or not. There's then a relationship that we'll see on the next slide to the underpinning technology that supports that service, and that's what ITIL refers to as the technical or supporting view of the service catalogue. So this diagram really pulls together a number of component and complementary elements within ITIL. So from top to bottom, what we're looking at is the business is represented in this case by 3 business units. So this could be the marketing department, the finance department and the HR department, or anything else. They would be acquiring services from their IT service provider, in this case services A, B and C, and the management of the provision of those services, we haven't come on to this yet, but we will soon, is through the SLA or service level agreement. That element that we described there, namely the services and the business units that are using those services, is what we would describe as the business or customer view of the service catalogue. Below that line, we've got all the supporting services. Now this would be the technology, the databases, the servers, everything that the customer doesn't normally see but is necessary to underpin and provide services A, B and C. Now in fact what ITIL calls this technical view of the service catalogue, we would more instantly recognise as the configuration management system. It's the documentation repository of all the technology elements that are necessary to deliver those services. And at the bottom line on this diagram, we recognise that we've got internal teams who are working together. This is the functions, the database team, the application management team, the server team, etc., that are working together to support these services that might, I'm not going to talk about this again, but I'll make reference to the fact, have an agreement between them that's called the operational level agreement to help understand the respective obligations of those teams. And then again, as we mentioned earlier, we are going to be reliant to one extent or another on third-party suppliers with whom we have a contract. Just as an aside, it's not possible to have a contract between two parts of the same organisation. It's not legally binding. And that's why we talk about contracts when we talk about suppliers, but we talk about agreements when we talk about the relationship between the service provider and the customers, and indeed between the internal service provider teams.